Good afternoon, everybody. It's Cowpimp here doing another build review. This time we have in patch 3.7 a Tectonic Slam Chieftain. The guy who submitted this build is using an Oni Goroshi, which I think is super awesome. I really like the item, and I think it pairs very well with Tectonic Slam. And Tectonic Slam is a skill that goes really well with Chieftain Ascendancy, especially the way that it was reworked in this most recent patch. So I'm going to be suggesting a variety of changes, some of which are more obvious efficiency changes that I definitely think you should implement. There's basically no loss or no change in playstyle or anything like that. It's just a matter of buffing raw numbers. And then there are some more significant changes to sort of playstyle and feel of the build that you'll have to decide whether that's a choice that you want to make or not. But let's start with the passive tree itself, and let's just take a look at what I think are just obvious efficiency changes that you should make. So number one, the first thing that I see is that you are investing 5 points, making your way over here to the Blade Dancer notable. So as a rule of thumb, I like to see a minimum of 3% increased damage per node spent to go somewhere. If all you're getting is damage, if you're getting some other kind of utility, fine. But in this case, you're not really, maybe like a tiny bit of AoE on one node, but I don't think 5% AoE is worth the fact that you are only getting 2% DPS per point by going over here. So instead, you get 5 points. You instantly can put 2 right here, and these 2 points give you more damage than all 5 of these did. They give you almost twice the damage. So the increase in efficiency you get by going here is pretty massive as opposed to here, and you still have 3 points left over. So that's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is get rid of this 3-point jewel node. So on the Reddit thread where the person who submitted this build responded to a post of mine, he mentioned that he does have a timeless jewel. So unless that timeless jewel, though, is actually bananas, you're probably better off moving the timeless jewel to one of these slots, seeing what kind of bonuses you get there, and then moving one of these jewels over here instead, and then just getting rid of this jewel. This jewel is just not very good. So that would be my suggestion. You usually need a very good jewel to warrant expending 3 points to put just a jewel in. And yeah, the little bit of armor is nice. Currently, you're not even scaling that, though, in any real significant way. So I would just get rid of these 3 points. So the next thing I think is questionable is the number of points invested over here to get into this life wheel and into this section. Even if you were to get that, I still am not sure that investing, let's see, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 travel points to go here and then here is really worth it. Especially when there's another way to get to this life wheel, which you probably want to do because your life is a little bit low. So here's how I would do it. I would connect the tree at the bottom with these 2 points, and then I would go up this way and connect like that, so you don't lose a jewel socket this way. And this will save you a ton of points. And I'll show you what we can do with those points in a little bit. But this is one of my favorite ways to path on the tree, because basically you get rid of 3 minor nodes for, technically you're using 4 here, but you're shifting this one to here and then getting rid of the 3 minor nodes when you could put them into something where you get a notable like here or wherever. The other thing is this puts you closer to the Templar starting area, which I think is more useful for your build. Here you get armor and regen, attack and cast speed, you get nice AoE, you get crit chance, pen, all resist. So I think these nodes are really good. If you ever needed accuracy too, these are pretty good. Right now you don't need accuracy, but you get move speed and you get attack speed and you get dex and accuracy. So they're actually really good nodes when you need the accuracy. So just worth having that in the back of your mind in case there are significant enough changes to the tree that these become efficient nodes. The next obvious cut I would make is this, because you're not using Warcry skills. Maybe that was related to the jewel you had in there, I'm not sure. But not using Warcry skills, I don't know why you have this, so don't take it if you're not using Warcry skills. The next couple points I think you should actually remove are these. They're okay. They're not the worst because you do get a lot of regen here, and maybe that's why you wanted them. But in terms of the actual damage efficiency, and this is the most efficient route to take, right? If we're just talking damage efficiency, it's not very efficient. It's just not. And the reason that it's not particularly efficient is because Fizz's extra fire for you is less valuable than on most builds, since you get a massive amount of that from the Her Embrace buff on Oni Goroshi. And this isn't even reflected in the tooltip here, but essentially it's like you have another 40% extra Fizz's fire from this right here. So on average. And so as a result, you're contributing more to this multiplier, this additive multiplier, when you already have a pretty good amount of it. So the value of this node is less for Oni builds than it is for other builds. So I would just cut those points. There are probably better places for you to spend them. In fact, like this will give you more damage right here, which I'm not suggesting you take that, but just as an example. Now all of a sudden, even with all these changes, we have 8 points to spend. I mean, these are pretty obvious points if you really want to go up there. You could do something like this to get a bunch more life. Whatever, you have a lot of options. But already you can see the damage is a good 20% higher than it was, and your life is higher than it was. The other points I think you should definitely take, well, this notable here, you shouldn't really be taking something actually like this or like this over that. But I would definitely get spec'd into that. And the other thing I would consider are these points here. Since endurance charge generation is important to you, and you are invested a bit in endurance charges, you get regen, and you get a ton of armor. Assuming you make the switch to armor, which is something that I'm going to talk about more later, and I do suggest for your build. But the endurance charge generation is pretty valuable for you. The other thing I like to do is also cut out minor nodes like this and focus on getting to more notables first. And then kind of once you've hit all the notables you really want to hit, then you can start filling in, little extra minor nodes that are decently valuable after that. But you should work on hitting those notables first, because usually they offer something more interesting. This is also a good choice, gives you a whole bunch of area of effect and a little bit of reduced damage taken from area hits. So those are the tree tweaks that I would suggest. And as you level up more and as you decide how you want to distribute your points, you can figure out where you want to put the rest of it. This could be useful if you go for a free cost main skill. These are really useful for the regen here if you find the Oni degen to be a problem. If you don't get reduced extra damage from crits anywhere else, this is really powerful. So you have a lot of options there, but this is how I would suggest routing in general in order to maximize the efficiency of the points you're using. All right, the next thing we're going to look at are your items. So as stated before, I think you should transition to using armor on your build as opposed to using evasion. I don't really understand why you chose to use evasion, because your increased evasion on your tree is almost non-existent. You technically had a little bit right here, and you have a little bit from your Shaper's Touch gloves, but it's not really enough to warrant it. You get almost all of your evasion from your Jade Flask in combination with the increased evasion rating during Flask effect on this flask, and I think that is a very questionable route to take to scale your base stats when you, even before I put these points in, you had over 100% increased armor on your tree, and it's really easy for you to get more than that, and armor is more valuable than it ever has been, because you already had Soul of Steel here, you already had these nodes here, you were spec'd there, but I have, going here now or here. So you get a pretty good amount of armor on the tree, and you can get more. These are not bad points to take, as I said earlier. If you, as you start approaching higher levels, it's a pretty good route to take, and you could be getting, really big increases in your armor. So you will get a lot more value out of a granite flask than a jade flask, and all the other gear on here that uses evasion should probably be swapped. Now, that said, Starkonja's is really good on its own. It provides a lot of dex if dex is something you need, though I think you can get that pretty easily without needing to equip the Starkonja's. And there are other good helm options for you. Notably, you want to find the Tectonic Slam Enchant to increase the odds of getting a charge slam. It's really good. And also just finding like a nice armor base and then getting the nearby enemies have minus fire resistance is also really strong and should give a similar amount of damage to what this provides. With that said, again, Starkonja's is a pretty good piece, and I would understand if you keep that even if you make the switch to primarily using armor. It's still not a bad helmet for you, and it may be one that you can find that helm enchant on more readily. Your chest right here, there are a lot of good mods to look for to upgrade this guy. First of all, it's just not a very good chest to begin with. Its life and resists are not particularly high, and there are a lot of interesting mods you can get on chests. You can get base crit chance to attack skills. You can get a 7th link in the form of a level 1 maim, which is like 15 or 20% more damage. And you can also get minus mana cost to skills, which could be valuable if you decide you want to try to make your skill free and potentially use another aura or mana reservation skill of some kind. You could even use Clarity with a Watcher's Eye Jewel that gives minus mana cost to skills to supplement it, or craft minus mana cost on your rings, and that would give you the flexibility of not having to run the Warlord's Mark curse, and instead being able to pick up some other kind of curse. A defensive one or an offensive one like Assassin's Mark. So you have a lot of options to go with there, and then you could also just run Loreweave. Loreweave is a great chest. If you are scaling armor, you lose out on some of that armor, but the extra max resistances you get from Loreweave are really powerful, and you take advantage of the Ellie damage, you take advantage of the flat fizz, take advantage of the crit. The base stats are nice, so it's just a really good all-around chest for you. So also worth considering. If you do that, you may consider dropping Soul of Steel, because the +1 to all maximum resistances is no longer as useful, is useless, and thus the wheel itself is no longer as useful as it was, and you're investing a travel point into it, so you may want to cut those if you end up going that route. So, Shaper's Touch gloves, definitely get rid of these. They're just not very good on your character. They're generally good on characters that are stacking a lot of base stats. You have more than most characters, but not enough, I think, to warrant Shaper's Touch, especially considering the base stat you have the most of. Strength is getting essentially no value. It provides energy shield and mana, both of which are not particularly useful to you. You have more than enough unreserved mana, and energy shield is basically non-existent on you, and is not sustained to any significant degree, so I would not bother with this at all. There are much better options. I think you just go with spiked gloves with attack speed, and whatever other juicy mods you can stuff on there. You can do plus AoE gems as a craft, +1 to AoE gems, which works on precision. which is really nice. It works on, let's say, Molten Shell if you end up going armor and switching to that, and potentially some other stuff that you have. It works on Wave of Conviction. Not that you really need that. I don't know. But the point is that that's a pretty nice craft. You could also consider Tomb Fist. Intimidate is good for you, but you may want the attack speed just because of the synergy it has with this node right here, where expending charges more quickly results in more damage as well. Boots, these are just not very good. You just need to boost the stats on them. No real special stats you need to go for on boots, though currently you don't have a way of getting Onslaught, so Onslaught on Kill could be a good craft. There's like a combo move speed Onslaught on Kill craft, so that could be a good route to go, but not too much you need here. Just get some with better life and resists. That's really all there is to it. Amulet is pretty decent. You have some of the damage modifiers you're really looking for. LE damage with attacks, crit multi. Look for Pen if you can. LE Pen will be really strong on you, and maybe Fizz as added fire. If you can get a good roll at a decent price, it will probably still be efficient, even though the Her Embrace buff gives you a lot of that already. The Amulet gives kind of a lot, so it's still probably going to give a pretty nice damage boost. So as you go to upgrade it, look for those stats, though this is an okay amulet. Also an okay ring. Potential things to look for on your rings are Curse on Hit. So if you stick with using Warlord's Mark on hit is good. Assassin's Mark on hit is good if you get rid of Warlord's Mark. Leaving open places to craft like plus minimum frenzy or power charges is pretty good, but flat physical damage should be pretty good for you still. So those are all good things to look for, but this is a pretty decent ring overall. This one is more mediocre and could use an upgrade for sure, but the suggestions basically remain the same. The other thing to potentially look for on all your jewelry is an open prefix to craft minus mana cost of skills. If you end up getting that on your chest, the socketed attack gems have minus mana cost of skills, and you want to try and go for a free attack skill. It's a really, really nice way to go, as I mentioned before. So if you go that route, then that's one of the main things you'll be looking for right here, and it would potentially let you run another aura, whatever that might be, maybe even something like Anger, and you can get a good Watcher's Eye with that. Your belt here is pretty decent, okay resists, really actually nice chaos res roll, but you know, there are places to go with this. A good Stygian Vice is going to be really powerful, one that has, you know, percent increased LE damage and LE damage with attack skills and fire damage and all that. You can get really big damage boosts on a belt, plus the jewel itself. So that's a route you could go. You could go for increased life recovery rate, which is a really good defensive option. I actually also think Belt of the Deceiver is underrated. You can get a corrupted one with a percent life implicit, and that gives a pretty hefty amount of damage because of the Intimidate and a decent amount of resists, so that you're not too starved for resistances. But, you know, so that's what I would aim for, is one of those routes here. But this is okay for now. I wouldn't say the top priority. Probably your second ring and your boots, your gloves, your chest, those are the first things to change, and then consider changing the helmet, consider upgrading the belt, all that. As far as your flask setup goes, I would get rid of Forbidden Taste. I don't think this is especially good unless you are running a character with a really high life pool, something like 8 to 10%. Granted, you do have a lot of chaos res, so the downside is not as bad for you, but I think this is a questionable choice, especially because as Chieftain, with this couple of points into your Ascendancy tree, you get increased life recovery rate, which works with flasks. So something like a Blood of the Karui would work almost as well as like an oh shit panic button over this. And you're also running another life flask, which I wouldn't do. I would just, first of all, I would cut one of them completely, and then I would probably not run this as stated unless you get up to having like 8 to 10,000 HP or something, and then all of a sudden, normal flasks don't cut it nearly as well. But Blood of the Karui will nearly refill your life pool completely over like a 2-second window, in combination with all the other sustain that you have. But yeah, Blood of the Karui synergizes really well with the increased life recovery rate and also this notable Juggernaut right here. Additionally, you are currently, as I said, running a Jade Flask. I would swap this for a Granite Flask. Lion's Roar is an excellent choice. It offers a lot more damage, and also, again, you will more efficiently be scaling armor than evasion if you just make that switch. And then this guy right here, you could just switch it so that instead of increased evasion rating, it's increased armor rating, or you could make this your Bleed Flask instead of this. But it's up to you. You could also do like a Shock Flask or something like that, depending on what you want to do with your other flasks. I like Overflowing Chalice just fine. I understand why people use it. I've used it a little in the past, and I've really liked it. So no arguments here, though you may find that you really want like a Curse Immunity Flask or something, and this is one you could cut. And Sulfur Flasks are pretty decent in general, just because of the fact that you can get like 3 to 4 uses out of them, depending on the modifiers on them. And then the last thing I would say is try to jam a Cinder Swallow urn in here somewhere. It's an Onslaught Flask. If I pull it up real quick, Cinder Swallow urn. So Onslaught Flask gives you life and mana on kill. You can get a bunch of regen or increased crit chance. Leech when you're hit. So a lot of interesting modifiers you can craft onto it. And then also the enemies ignited by you during Flask effect take 10% increased damage is really powerful as well. You could even link an offering skill to one of your cast when damage taken to make sure that this is up more often, since it does recharge a charge when you consume an ignited corpse. So that will really help the uptime on this. Just an option. You don't have to do that. So that's how I would rework these guys. Okay, next thing to talk about here is currently you are using Immortal Call on cast when damage taken. I think that is a little bit questionable. And the reason why, I understand why you do it. You do it so that you can take advantage of the more damage modifier listed here. But you have to consider that as soon as Immortal Call triggers, you lose all this regen, so you lose a few % regen. And then additionally, you lose the increased damage per endurance charge listed right here. Actually, also, you lose the ability to charge slam for a little bit until you regain some charges. And so as a result, initially, you probably don't do any more damage. It's not until you actually regain some of your endurance charges that you start doing as much damage. Granted, you probably do that pretty quickly in packs of monsters, but against tougher bosses and stuff, you probably actually are down on DPS for a little while. So my suggestion is that you try and get your attack speed up through various means. Get the glove mod. You can actually get attack speed on an amulet too. And I'll show you some other stuff later that will help boost your attack speed potentially, so that you can expend charges more frequently. Also, the Helm Enchant I referenced earlier with the increased chance to get a charge slam with Tectonic Slam is a great way to take more advantage of this, and that way you will fairly reliably keep up your endurance charges. The other thing is switching to Molten Shell helps. Molten Shell is a fire skill and will contribute to this form of endurance charge generation, granted on your tree. And then if you take these as well, you basically should be pretty topped off, maybe down 1 to 2 charges temporarily sometimes. As well, it's probably worth speccing into these at some point, depending on what level you are. So I would probably change that. I'm also not the biggest fan of Blood Rage if you're not taking advantage of the leech, but frenzy charges are really, really nice. And if you're not going to craft like minimum frenzy charges or something, obviously it's still really good. I don't know. It's just like a weird thing I have where I don't like when you don't really fully take advantage of something. But frenzy charges are still good for general mapping as long as you can handle this degen in combination with the Oni degen, then fine. Okay, the double ancestral totem setup. I've used it before. I think it is one of those things that is a path of building trick that looks really good on paper, but in real combat scenarios is not very good. What ends up happening is that the vast majority of the time, you're not going to use these because you're just jumping into packs of monsters, and it's actually slower for you to stop, place a totem than it is to just jump in and kill them. So there's that. Against bosses without immunity phases, the amount of time you spend standing there placing your totems is not worth it because the bosses will often kill the totems. Some boss fights it'll be fine, but the totems are actually going to die way before this 12-second window is up, and as a result, there's actually an opportunity cost there because you have to stop moving, cast the totem from a safe range before you can jump in and start DPSing. If you were just hitting them during that time, it would be like having a more damage modifier, right? Because you would just be hitting them more rather than off to the side placing the totem. So I think having both is not worth it. I think having one is good, and I think Veil War Chief is really good for you, in part two because the Veil Totem itself is super tanky and can actually survive through like endgame bossing situations. It has a ton more health, and as a result, I think that it gets its value even in those tougher boss fights. So I would just cut this and just stick with this personally. I also don't even bother a lot of times unless I just have the free spot on my skill bar, binding a key to the regular version of War Chief, again, for the same reasons I said, where it just dies in the situations you really want it anyway, pretty easily. I would just rather cast the Veil version, and it's up pretty often anyway. I actually just throw it down pretty frequently when mapping, when I'm encountering large packs. I think all these are pretty strong, and it's nice you have a couple levels to go on this, so you'll see a little boost to your accuracy if you end up reworking your gear to lose some dex. The couple points you get here should offset any loss in hit chance you get here. Okay, so let's talk about your Tech Slam links. So immediately, first change I would make is swap Ruthless for Rage. If you go in here, set the Rage to 50, so when Rage is all maxed out, it gives you 55% more damage as opposed to Ruthless, which is 43% more damage. So even when you're not capped on Rage, you're still going to do a lot more. And even at 10 points of Rage, which is kind of the critical threshold, you're actually most of the way there, right? Like, the damage boost that Ruthless is giving is only 50% more than 10 points of Rage accumulated, which you get to really easily. And don't forget, too, that Rage is giving you attack speed, it's giving you movement speed, it's giving you the ability to run the Berserk temporary buff, which is really, really strong, and I highly recommend you give that a shot. So I think that this is an easy pick over Ruthless as well. It has particularly high power with your build because the Oni Goroshi sword doesn't have a super high base damage. A lot of its damage comes from the Her Embrace buff. Next, Concentrated Effect. I would consider swapping this for Close Combat. Close Combat, if you're just doing this drop-down list, organizing by most efficient damage, it won't show up because it doesn't work with POB. So it may be the reason you didn't select it, or maybe you've tried it and you didn't like it. But, it gives as much or more damage than Concentrated Effect, and it also makes it so that leap slam gets a nice boost to attack speed, so that you can jump between packs really easily in real world combat scenarios. And I think it feels great. I highly suggest you at least try this in place of Conk Effect. It is possible that instead of Conk Effect, you're using increased AoE for just general mapping, and I can understand that. But I would at least give this a try, and in fact, I would try this over melee physical damage. Feels that good, because I've used it on one of my characters. So at least give that a try. The other thing to consider is swapping Fortify for some other damage modifier, Ruthless, Fire Pen, whatever it might be. There's a lot of good options there, but I'm not saying you have to do this. Fortify is totally viable as a main link, but I think you're using the kind of build where you would do just fine to leave it proccing on your movement skill. First of all, you have these nodes, which give some increased duration to Fortify, which feels really good. And as well, you are running the kind of build where you're probably going to be jumping around and hitting people, and especially if you end up using close combat, you may find that Fortify feels less necessary on your main links. But it's up to you. The trade-off in damage may be very worth it in your mind, and I understand that, and it's obviously a very valid decision. So, if that's the case, you just link it to your Leap Slam. Another thing you could consider with Leap Slam, just as another form of endurance charge generation redundancy to really keep yourself topped off as much as you can, is endurance charge on melee stun linked in here somewhere, maybe even over the ice golem, whatever, depending on how you rework stuff here. I don't know how many spots on your skill bar you have open, but you might open one up by getting rid of the Protector or the regular version of War Chief. But if you do that, you could take these guys off of cast when damage taken, manually cast your guard skill, which I'm suggesting should be Molten Shell, manually cast this, and maybe cut increased duration in those cases, and then all of a sudden you have some extra links to work with if you need them, or at least partly do that. So if you do that, that would allow you to do blood magic here. It would allow you to do endurance charge on melee stun. Anyway, so worth considering those potential changes to the way your movement skill works. And then this setup looks pretty good. Again, if you can get Warlord's Mark on hit on a ring, that's great. If you can make your skills cost nothing and don't need to rely on this for leech, that's great. If you can run a defensive curse here instead, let's say you get rid of the Warlord's Mark and you want to run Enfeeble, cast when damage taken, that's always a good option. So there's a lot of good options here. You could even just cut this entirely. You could do Assassin's Mark instead. Whatever. There's a lot of different options there, depending on what you do with the rest of your build and how that interacts with this setup. So that's how I would change the links around personally. Some of them are suggestions and a lot of it is preference, so you got to see if it works for you. And I think that pretty much summarizes the changes I would make, or things that you should consider changing, that you might want to play around with. I'm the kind of guy who I will invest currency in just testing things out. Maybe that's not that reasonable for you to do. You have to decide whether it's worth it or not to test it. But I think it's worth doing that. That's part of the fun of this game for me, is just experimenting with builds. And there's no right or wrong way to do things. I mean, yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of higher versus lower numbers, but sometimes it's a matter of playstyle and feel of the build. And so you have to see, do I like having more active skills? Do I like having more triggered skills? How important is movement speed or attack speed to me? That kind of thing. So anyway, take those considerations into mind. See what you can do, and let me know how it turns out. Anybody else who has any builds they're interested in having me review, let me know. Comment, come in my stream and ask. We could sort of do like live build reviews. I like to do that on stream. It's a fun change of pace. So just pop in and let me know. I'm happy to do it. I enjoy discussing it and looking at these things. So until next time, ciao.